Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I'd like to talk about a sensitive subject today, your money. Actually, I'd like to talk about God's money and the law of tithing. I'm going to take one of the stories from Pioneer Stories by Brother Preston Nibley. I'm also going to share some stories out of this book, The Best Love Stories of the Latter-day Saints. I'm going to end with another story from Preston Nibley. Faith Promoting Stories is the book. These are both out of print, but they're great books. The first story is told by Joseph Fielding Smith. His mother was the widow of Hiram Smith. She was an amazing woman. One spring, it had been a hard, long winter. Food was a little scarce in the valley, and particularly potatoes. And as they opened their potato pit for the spring, she had her boys go down into the potato pit and load a wagon full of their best potatoes. Back in those days, tithing was paid in kind. You paid with chickens, cows, horses, grain, poultry, eggs, produce. You gave a tenth of what you produced to the Lord. So they had bishop's storehouses for the tithing offices. This picture is of the Provo tithing office. You can tell by the front door that people would pull their wagons right up to the tithing office and unload them. This building is down on 1600 North Geneva Road. It's on the Bunnell farm. As Widow Smith and her sons pulled up to the tithing office, the clerk, Brother William Thompson, came out and chided her. He said, "Widow Smith, it's a shame that you should have to pay tithing. There's others that are supported by what you give, and they're more able to earn a living than you are." And she looked at him, and this is what she said: "William, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Would you deny me a blessing? If I did not pay my tithing, I should expect the Lord to withhold his blessings from me. I pay my tithing not because it is a law of God, but because I expect a blessing by doing so. By keeping this and other laws, I expect to prosper and to be able to provide for my family." And President Smith said that you could check the rolls that Widow Smith never received any assistance from the church or the state in any way throughout her life. And yet she raised a wonderful family, and they all learned the concept and principle of hard work. I found this account in two books, and I found it interesting that the book that was published in the late 90s left the next part out. I think we've become so soft in our society that we're afraid to speak up about certain subjects. So I'd like to read what President Joseph F. Smith said about this. "This may be said to be personal. By some it may be considered egotistical, but I do not speak of it in this light. When William Thompson told my mother she ought not pay tithing, I thought he was one of the finest fellows in the world. I believed every word he said. I had to dig and toil myself. I had to help plow the ground, plant the potatoes, hoe the potatoes, dig the potatoes, and all sorts of things. And then to load up a big wagon full of the very best we had, leaving out the poor ones for us and bringing the load to the tithing office. I thought in my childish way that it looked a little hard, especially when I saw certain of my playmates and early associates of childhood playing, riding horses, and having a good time, who scarcely ever did a lick of work in their life, and yet being fed from the public crib. Where are those boys today? Are they or were they ever valiant in the testimony of Jesus? Have they a clear testimony of the truth in their hearts? Are they diligent members of the church? No, and never have been as a rule, and most of them are dead or vanished out of sight. Well, after a few years of experience, I was converted. I found that my mother was right, and William Thompson was wrong. He denied the faith, apostatized, left the country and led away as many of his family as would go with him. I do not want you to deny me the privilege of being numbered with those who have interests in Zion at heart, who desire to contribute their portion to the upbuilding of Zion and for the maintenance of the work of the Lord on this earth. I thought that was beautifully put, that here was a family that had to scratch and work, put in overtime, and do whatever they could, but they found the principle of work important enough and knew and had a testimony of tithing. I have a strong testimony of tithing. I have one of my episodes that talk about a near-death experience that I had. I had a head-on car accident in Daniels Canyon. I was in a Volkswagen. They were in a huge Buick, and I should have died and had the opportunity to leave this earth. And while I was in the hospital, in intensive care, it was in the 3rd week of December, my bishop came in. I didn't have insurance in the accident, and so I had a huge debt for the other car, for the hospital bills, for everything that had taken place. When the bishop came to visit me, I said, "You know, Bishop, it's tithing settlement time, and I need to settle my tithes for the year," and I owed $17.50. My good friend Doug Porter happened to be there, and I said, "Doug, I didn't have any cash because I didn't even have clothing. They cut it all off me in the accident." And I said, "Doug, lend me some money so I can pay my tithing, and I'll pay you back later," which I did. And the bishop looked at me and said, "Oh, Lance, you don't have to pay your tithing today. You shouldn't pay your tithing right now. You've got a lot of bills you need to take care of." And I basically told my bishop the same thing. I said, "Bishop, I need the Lord's blessings, especially financial blessings, right now in my life more than I ever have." And I was able to overcome the hospital bills and the insurance settlements and everything from that accident and pay them off. I know it was because I was blessed by the Lord. Even though it's another book, Preston Nibley is quoted in this under the story, A Testimony of Tithing. He was in the Sunday school presidency and traveled back to Rhode Island for a area conference, and he met a branch president who was from Providence. He asked this brother, "I understand you have a powerful testimony of tithing." He had heard him quoted, and so the man said, "Yes, I do." And he goes, "Well, tell me about it." He said, "Well, my family and I were converted to the church while we lived in England, but I'm no hypocrite, and I did not feel I could pay tithing. I was under contract to a large company. We had a measured amount of finance that came in. We knew what our bills were, and our belt was as tight as it could be. So I told the elders that visited I would not join the church because I didn't have a testimony of tithing." And this went on for some time, for a couple of years. And one day the elder that had baptized my family knocked on the door. And he came in and said, "Brother, before I go home, I want to baptize you. Please let me baptize you." And I repeated my concern to him about tithing, and he had the Spirit of the Lord come over him. The light shone in his eyes, and he said, "Brother, I promise you that if you will pay your tithing and be baptized by me before I go home, in 1 year, you and your family will live in America, and you will make 3 times as much as you make now." Well, the brother felt the Spirit and decided to test this elder's promise and to try the Lord. He was baptized. Shortly afterwards, a company from the United States came to England. Apparently during World War I, it was extremely difficult to find cloth in the United States that would hold its color. And yet cloth that had been made in Britain seemed to have the advantage. So this company had sent someone over to poach an employee. They went to this man's father. He was an authority on the subject and offered him a very lucrative position. And he said, I'm not interested, but my son might be. They went to this man, who's now the branch president in Providence, and asked him if he would go to work for them. And he said, I can't. I'm still under contract with the company I work for, and I will be for 2 more years. They offered to buy out his contract, move his family, and set him up in the United States with a raise. And within 1 year of this elder's promise, he was living in America, he had a home, and he was making 4 times as much as he had made while he did the same work in England. The next story is also out of this book, and it's from Heber J. Grant. A lot of people have a testimony of tithing. Many Christians that aren't even members of our church understand the power of this great promise. And as Malachi says, to try the Lord, to put him to the test, and see if he will not open the windows of heaven to you. But the kingdom of God requires many sacrifices and offerings. We don't do it with animals on an altar since the time of Christ, but we're allowed to make offerings. Those that have been to the temple have covenanted to give all of their time, talents, energy, and all they possess. And yet some people struggle with making donations. This story about Heber J. Grant took place back when the church held fast meeting on Thursday morning, the first Thursday of the month. Brother Grant had $50 in his pocket that he had earned, and he was going to go to the bank and deposit that after the meeting. And the bishop got up and gave a rousing talk and said that they needed financial contributions for some things that the ward and the area were involved with, and promised those saints that if they would donate to this cause, that they would receive 4-fold. So Brother Grant went up to the bishop, reached in his pocket and handed him the $50. And the bishop looked at it and he said, Brother Grant, your mother's a widow. You can't afford to give me this kind of money. And he took $5 and said, we'll just take the tithing. And he handed him back the $45. Brother Grant looked at the bishop and said, by what right do you rob me of the Lord's blessings? And the bishop looked at him and kind of shocked. He said, you just promised this congregation that anything they donated would be returned 4-fold. My mother's a widow and she needs $200. And the bishop kind of chuckled a little. He said, you think that if you give me this $50, you'll get $200 for your mother? And he goes, yes, I believe that. The bishop took the money. This is what he said. While walking home from fast meeting to the place where I worked, an idea popped into my head. I sent a telegram to a man asking him how many bonds of a certain kind he would buy at a specified price within 48 hours, and allow me to draw a draft on his account. He was a man whom I did not know. I had never spoken to him in my life, but I had seen him a time or two on the streets of Salt Lake. He wired back that he wanted as many of the bonds as I could get. My profit on that transaction was $218.50. The next Sunday, I walked up to the bishop and said, Bishop, I made $218.50 after paying that $50 donation the other day. So I owe $21.85 for tithing. The Lord did not quite give me enough tithing in addition to the 4-to-1 increase you promised. Some would say this would never happen. I do not think I would have gotten the idea. I do not think I would have sent the telegram without a prompting from the Lord. The Lord does bless our fields and our homes. Our fields may not consist of an agricultural nature at this point, but the things that we're involved with, the expenses we have and the ways of earning can be blessed immediately. I've been self-employed all my life, and I've had the opportunity to test the Lord many times. One time we were a little close. It seems like expenses were popping up I hadn't planned on, and The jobs that I thought I was going to be paid for were a little slow in coming. And I knelt down and I realized I had not paid my tithing on the last check I'd gotten yet. And so I transferred the funds, and then I knelt down, and while I was praying, my phone rang, and it was a job that I hadn't planned on. It was a cash job that I was paid immediately for and was more than able to meet the obligations that I had. I know the Lord blesses us for paying tithing and for other offerings that we give. Another story from this book is by George Albert Smith, and it's very interesting. He was assigned to go to a conference down in Utah County, and the week prior to leaving to go down there, he ran into an old lifelong friend that he'd known since childhood. The man was quite well off. As they talked, Brother George Albert Smith felt impressed to invite this man to drive with he and his wife down to Utah County that weekend and to join them in this conference. George Albert Smith said the man had a beautiful large car, and he says the make of car I was driving had not been received into society at that time. So he must have been driving an Etzel or something. But as they drove down there, this man went on about the trips they'd taken to the east and here and there and everywhere, and he was quite ready to share his experiences. George Albert Smith had the idea when the conference was about to start to ask this man to speak. And he got up and gave a very entertaining, good talk. Wasn't very spiritual. On the way home, President Smith asked him how he liked the conference, and he said, "Oh, it was a wonderful conference. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me." And George Albert thought to himself, well, he probably enjoyed it because he spoke. They talked about religious things, and the man said, "I do have one question, though." He said, "I don't seem to have the same testimony of tithing that you have." And George Albert Smith said, "Well, tell me about tithing and how it is in your life." And the man said, "Well, I'll tell you how I do it. I have a system. It works beautifully. If I make $10,000 in a year, I open an account and I put $1,000 in that account. And then if the bishop gets up and asks for donations for the building fund, or if there's a missionary in need, or a family down the street that needs food, I'll write a check out of that account. And before the end of the year, I've donated that money to those in need." He goes, "What do you think of that?" And George Albert Smith looked at him and said, "I think you are very generous with someone else's money." He said the guy almost wrecked the car. He said, what do you mean?" He goes, "Well, that's not your money. That's the Lord's money. You're his partner, and you don't have the right to determine how your tithing is used. You pay your tithing. And if you want to make other donations to the needy or to the building fund or anything else, you make those donations. That's part of the law of consecration." And before that man died, he came into President Smith's office and thanked him. And he said, "The Lord has blessed us spiritually and physically for properly obeying the law of tithing." The last story I want to share is from another of Brother Nibley's book, Faith Promoting Stories. It's told by William C. Ridlich. Brother Ridlich said by the spring of 1860 they had saved $500. He and his wife had been very private about it, but the day arrived, and I hope you've all had the feeling of going down to buy another car when you have your eye on that beautiful rig. And that's the way this good brother was. He walked into the streets of Salt Lake City, had this money, and was ready to make a good deal. It was after a lot of the wagons had become available from the gold rush prophecy of Brother Kimball. And so there were good wagons and teams available. And as he walked down the street, Heber C. Kimball walked up to him and shook his hand and said, "Brother Ridlich, I would like you to lend me that $500 you have in your pocket." And this poor brother was a little shocked because no one knew about this money but he and his wife. And his wife was very excited to be able to have a good wagon and a team to do a lot of the work that they had to do. And he thought, oh, my wife will kill me if I give him that money. he he hummed and hawed for a minute in his mind, and then he reached into his pocket and he handed Brother Kimball 25 $20 gold pieces. After he handed him the money, Heber C. Kimball looked at him and said, within 3 months, this money will have doubled in your hands. And I'm sure he thought, I hope so, because I don't know how I'm going to explain this to my wife. He went home and was a little worried. He told his wife what had happened. And 2 weeks later, when he was speaking with Heber C. Kimball, he told him that he had taken 2 fine mules to settle a debt that a man had. And so he walked over, and they were just an excellent pair of animals. They settled on a price of $200 for these 2 mules. Brother Kimball mentioned that he had a very fine new harness that he'd sell him for $40, which Brother Ridlich said was a little high, but he decided to take it. And then as he was getting ready to leave, Brother Kimball mentioned there was a wrecked wagon's running gear. And it was a very good wagon, but it had no box. It had been wrecked up in the mountains, and they had brought it down to the valley with just the wheels and the frame. And he was able to buy that for $80. Then Brother Kimball mentioned, my son has a box that they took off and put another wagon box on, and I think it might fit this wagon. And so he went over, and sure enough, the box fit perfectly on this wagon frame. And so he drove home with his beautiful team of mules, brand new harness, and his new wagon. And he was quite proud when he showed them to his wife. And 2 weeks later, he received a letter from a man and advised him that he was looking for 2 mules. He needed to find a good pair of mules because he was going back east to buy supplies and return to the valley. So Brother Ridlich told him, come over to my place and you can take a look at these 2 mules. They're fine animals. And so he did. The man came over and was very impressed with the mules. And he traded a fine Durham bull, 5 heifers, 4 cows, and quite a few calves for those 2 mules. Brother Ridlich said that the value of those animals was at least $500. Then he said a couple of weeks later, Brother Kimball contacted him and said that he had a fine horse that was available. A man that owed Heber C. Kimball $150 had offered him this beautiful horse to settle the debt. Brother Ridlich told him, I'm not really looking for a horse. I have a horse and I don't need another one. And he said, well, come look at it. It's a beautiful animal. And so he reluctantly went down, and it was a beautiful horse. Heber C. Kimball had to coax him along a little bit. He took the horse home, and he had no need for the horse, so he just turned him out to pasture. A week later, an officer from Camp Floyd that had come into the valley looking for horses for the cavalry knocked on his door, and he said, that is a fine-looking animal you have in the pasture. Would you be willing to sell me that? And he negotiated with him and received $300 cash for that horse. At that point, he still had a small balance with Heber C. Kimball. He must have been a wise man. Heber C. Kimball owned a store, and he went into that store and settled the rest of the money that Heber C. Kimball owed him by taking trade. And one of the things he got was a beautiful shawl that his wife prized for the rest of his life. So he was a smart guy. And within 3 months, Brother Ridlich testified that he had received over $1,000 worth of property and cash for trusting the promise of an apostle of the Lord. The Latter-day Saint people in general are very trusting, hard-working people. And we have been taken advantage of in white-collar crimes more than a few times. But when an apostle or a prophet of the Lord makes you a promise, or when an ecclesiastical leader asks for a donation to the church to help further the Lord's kingdom on earth, I promise you that the Lord will pay you back with interest and is very generous with those who are generous with the things that he has blessed them with. Sometimes things become very theoretical with religion, but the promise of tithing is not theoretical. It's something that the Lord specifically promises that if you will obey, you will be blessed. And I know this is true. I have tested it many, many times in my life, and the Lord has always been there to bless me in the ways that were best for me. I know that the Lord loves me. I believe he knows me better than I know myself. He can see my eternal promise. And I know that he knows you. You may not be able to see over the obstacles that are before you, but if you will look down and just take the next step, whatever it might be, I promise, as you ask for the Lord's help, you will feel his guiding influence in your life, and you too will come to know that the Lord knows you, and he loves you, and he wants you to be happy. He will help you, he will strengthen you, he will guide you, and allow you to negotiate the trials of this earth so that we can return to him. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. You can subscribe here. If you've enjoyed this story, you might enjoy this one. You can also watch all of Brother Merrill's inspirational stories right here. Thank you.